In October 2023, she was found wandering 50 kilometers off all known desert routes. She had no memory of the missing 5 days. The morning had started like any other, bright, dry, and humming with heat even before the sun had fully risen. The tour guide had warned the group not to stray too far from the main vehicles, but she wasn't the kind of person who liked to be confined by lines on a map. Besides, she only planned to walk a short distance, just far enough to take a few photos of the rising sun against the dunes before the footprints of the day began to ruin the illusion. Her name was Clara, and she had been traveling through southern Africa for almost a month. She was used to solitude, used to silence. That's why she had come here in the first place, to feel small beneath the sky, to listen to the wind, and to remember that most of the world didn't need human noise to be complete. At first, she followed a faint ridge through the sand, letting her boots sink just deep enough to feel grounded. The air was crisp, almost cool in the early hour. The sky above her was a pale gradient of soft blue and bone white. She turned around once or twice, checking her orientation, and even snapped a photo of the tire tracks from the last safari vehicle. It was a simple precaution. She didn't expect to need it. But sometime between her fifth photo and the moment she decided to go just a little farther, something shifted. She couldn't say when it happened exactly. There was no dramatic turn, no fall, no storm. The landscape just slowly became unfamiliar. The ridges she had followed seemed to flatten out. The wind picked up slightly, blurring her tracks behind her. And when she turned to retrace her steps, the horizon looked the same in every direction. Still, she didn't panic. Not yet. She adjusted the straps on her backpack, took a sip from her water bottle, and chose a direction that felt correct. She even laughed a little, talking to herself out loud, saying it would make a good story when she returned to camp an hour later. But the minutes stretched, and the light sharpened. Shadows shortened. The air became hotter and thinner. And still, no sign of the vehicles, no tracks, no movement. By late morning, Clara knew she was lost. She stopped walking and stood still, trying to listen, trying to feel any shift in the wind that might carry sound.
There was nothing, not a bird, not an insect, not even the soft rattle of dry plants. The only sound was the sand shifting slowly around her boots as if the ground itself was breathing. She checked her phone. No signal. The screen showed a blank grid of compass points, none of them moving. Her water was already half gone. The sun pressed down harder now, and she pulled the scarf over her head to protect her neck. Every breath came warmer than the last. Her lips had begun to dry and crack. The sand started to take on a shimmering tone, distorting the edges of dunes into illusions of movement. At one point, she thought she saw a white tent in the distance. She moved toward it, only to find nothing but wind-carved emptiness. Still, she kept walking. By early afternoon, the nausea began. Her body wasn't used to this kind of heat without shelter. She staggered down a slope and found a rare patch of shadow cast by a sun-bleached rock. It was barely large enough to crouch under, but it was enough. There she curled into herself, breathing slow, rationing her water into mouthfuls so small they barely touched her tongue. That night, the desert turned cold with no warning. She wrapped herself in the emergency foil sheet from her backpack and huddled into the sand. Sleep came in broken fragments, short, vivid flashes of memory and fear. She dreamed of walking in circles. She dreamed of voices she didn't recognize, speaking in a low rhythm like distant radio static. And when she woke near dawn, Her eyes opened, not to the stars, but to a faint glow in the distance. It was orange, steady, faint. Not a sunrise, not a mirage. A man-made light. She stood, legs shaking, and moved toward it. Whatever it wasn't part of the tour. Clara moved toward the light with a mix of hope and suspicion. It pulsed gently in the dark, steady enough to feel real, but distant enough to remain uncertain. The sand made her steps uneven. Each movement drained more energy than the one before. Her water was gone. Her throat was dry. Her vision wavered at the edges. Still, she pressed forward. It took her longer than she expected to reach the source. When the building came into view, it was not what she had imagined. It wasn't a camp or a shelter or even a functioning outpost. It was a low, concrete structure, partially buried in sand, with a short antenna rising from its roof like a broken tooth. The outer walls were weathered and cracked, stained by decades of wind and heat. Faded paint marked the doorway, though the letters were unreadable. Above the door, a rusted metal plate hung loose, occasionally tapping against the wall in the wind. The orange light had been coming from inside. She stepped forward, cautious, and placed her hand on the metal door. It opened with a sharp creak. Inside, the air was cooler, stale, but bearable. The room was dim, lit only by a single emergency bulb mounted near the ceiling. Sand covered most of the floor, blown in through gaps and cracks over time. Along the walls were old desks, file cabinets, and outdated equipment. Most of it had been abandoned in place, as if whoever worked here had simply walked out and never returned. Clara moved slowly, taking in the details. There were maps pinned to the wall, their corners curled and faded. A calendar from 1986 hung near a broken clock. On one desk sat a bulky shortwave radio, its metal frame spotted with rust. The dial glowed faintly, though she couldn't tell if it was receiving anything. Below it, a notebook lay open. The pages were warped and stained, filled with columns of numbers, most of them meaningless, some of them underlined multiple times. She reached for the notebook, but hesitated. Instead, she sank into the chair beside it and leaned forward, resting her head in her hands. She had found shelter. That mattered. The structure blocked the sun. It held some warmth. There was no food or water in sight, but it was better than the open desert, better than walking in circles. Her body shook as the adrenaline wore off. For the first time in 2 days, she let herself cry. Not from pain, not even from fear, just exhaustion. The kind that lives deep in the bones, only visible once you finally stop moving. When her breathing calmed, she stood and began searching the room. She opened every drawer, every locker, looking for supplies. In one metal cabinet, she found a box of emergency rations. The labels were worn, the contents probably decades old, but inside were 2 small bottles of water and a vacuum-packed biscuit. It was enough.
Maybe not for long, but enough to survive another day. She sat again, carefully opening one bottle and sipping it slowly. The silence in the building was complete. No wind, no distant sounds. Even her own breath seemed quieter inside these walls. Then something clicked. It was faint, mechanical, low, but unmistakable. She turned toward the radio. The dial had moved. Not far, just a few notches to the right. She hadn't touched it. She stood, walked closer, and leaned in. The speaker hissed softly, then paused. And in the pause, a whisper cut through the static. It was brief, one sentence, muted, impossible to understand fully. But the voice was real, and Clara wasn't sure it was speaking English. Clara stood in front of the radio for a long time, waiting to hear the voice again. But the static had returned, thin, soft, and featureless. She leaned closer, adjusting the dial slowly, not sure what she was searching for. Every movement changed the tone slightly, but nothing repeated that first whisper. It had been so brief, so sudden, that she had almost convinced herself she imagined it. Still, she couldn't shake the sensation it left behind. The words hadn't been clear, but the cadence was unmistakable. A pattern, a rhythm, like something not just speaking, but reciting. It hadn't sounded mechanical. It hadn't sounded random either. It was deliberate, calm, too calm. She turned the knob one more time, pausing on a low-frequency hum that pulsed at regular intervals. It didn't sound like a signal meant for voice transmission, more like data. Still, she kept it there. It filled the silence just enough to make her feel less alone. She sat back down and opened the second bottle of water, taking small sips between breaths. The air inside the station was dry and still. Dust floated in narrow shafts of orange light that slipped in through the cracked vents. The walls, once white, had faded into the pale yellow of neglect. It was hard to tell how long this place had been empty. It felt like no one had touched anything in decades. And yet, the light still worked. The radio still ran. Someone had been here after the collapse. Or maybe, someone never left. Clara rose and walked to the far end of the room, where a narrow hallway led to a storage area. She found more equipment there, measuring instruments, sealed boxes, rolls of brittle paper.
Some of it had been scorched, like it had endured heat damage long ago. In one of the drawers, she found a flashlight. To her surprise, it still worked. The beam was weak but steady. She moved into the back room, following a cold draft that slid under the metal door. The room was smaller, built like a bunker. Inside, the air was cooler. A single cot stood in the corner, the blanket neatly folded. On the wall above it, someone had carved a series of numbers into the concrete. They weren't dates, they weren't coordinates, just numbers, scratched in clusters, sometimes repeating, sometimes scattered. She wrote a few down in her notebook, not because she knew what they meant, but because they felt important, the kind of thing your brain recognizes even when your logic doesn't. When she returned to the front room, the radio had stopped humming. In its place was silence. Not dead air, but intentional silence. The kind that made the hair on her arms rise. She waited, standing perfectly still. Then, it spoke again. The voice was clearer this time, still low, still distant, but now it formed recognizable syllables. Not words she understood, but ones that had structure. They echoed faintly, as if traveling from far away. The speaker repeated the phrase 3 times, the same tone, the same pause between each one. Clara stepped back. The light flickered once, then held. She wanted to turn the radio off, wanted to break the pattern, but she didn't, because in the space between the words, she thought she heard something else layered beneath them. Breathing, slow, measured, familiar. She wasn't sure how long she stood there listening to the loop, barely blinking. Her body felt numb, not from fear, but from something deeper. Recognition without understanding. And as the last word echoed out one final time, she realized something she hadn't noticed before. The voice wasn't coming from the radio. It was inside the room. Clara backed away from the radio, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and throat. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the dim room, listening for movement.
for any sign she wasn't alone. But nothing stirred. The station remained still. The only sound was the soft rattle and dust shifting across the floor. She forced herself to sit down again, trying to slow her thoughts.
The voice hadn't spoken since then. The silence now felt heavier, like something was waiting for her to react. She looked at her notebook, where she had written the carved numbers from the back room. 17, 4, 9, 17, 9, 4, 17. There were more, dozens of them. Some repeated in patterns, others seemed random. But a few stood out, not because of their shape, but because they triggered something in her memory. Not from this trip, not from this place, from earlier, from childhood. She flipped the notebook shut and stood again. Back in the rear room, she scanned the wall more carefully this time. The numbers weren't the only marks. Beneath some of the older clusters, faint scratches hinted at words, mostly illegible, faded by time and dust. But one message had been pressed in deeper than the rest. It read, "Stay past night. It finds you." She ran her fingers over the letters, feeling the groove of each one. Someone had been here long enough to write that. Someone had seen something, experienced something, and they had taken the time to warn whoever came next. Clara glanced at her watch. It was almost evening again. The heat had finally begun to lift, but the light outside was slipping into that flat, golden shade that marked the beginning of desert nightfall. She should have felt safer inside the station, but now the walls felt close, the silence too clean. The structure, though solid, no longer felt like protection. She returned to the front room and moved toward the radio. The dial hadn't shifted again, but the screen had gone completely dark. She tapped it, turned the knob, adjusted the antenna. Nothing responded, just silence. And behind that silence, a strange awareness. She picked up the notebook again and began flipping through older pages she hadn't noticed before. Near the back, someone had written short journal entries. Fragments, really. No names, no context, just scattered thoughts. Third night, static patterns changing. The voice called again. I don't think it knows I can hear it. Numbers matched the ones from the wall. Coincidence? Radio turned itself off. Cold tonight. It's not the heat that gets to you. It's the memory. Clara stopped reading. Her hands were trembling. She didn't understand what was happening.
She didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't come out here expecting mystery. But she also knew her senses were sharp, even in fatigue. The voice was real. The numbers were real. And now, something deeper was beginning to form between them. Not just fear, but familiarity. Like she had seen this pattern before, in dreams, in flashes, in pieces of other places she had visited, but never remembered clearly. She sat in the corner, knees drawn up, listening to the silence again. She waited for the voice to return, but it didn't. What came instead was the wind. Not strong at first, just a whisper along the outer walls, like a finger tracing the edge of the structure. It built slowly, carrying sand with it, pushing against the metal with low groans. The lights dimmed slightly as the sky outside turned pale orange, then faded into gray. Then the wind spoke, not in words, in rhythm. A slow, pulsing beat, like breath behind cloth. It circled the station, It pressed against the glass, and deep inside the wall, something creaked in response. Not mechanical, not natural, something else entirely. And Clara realized night had arrived. Clara noticed the shift before it fully arrived. At first, it was just a subtle change in the air pressure, a distant groan carried on the wind. Then came the sound of the antenna rattling on the roof, followed by a low hum that rose from the ground and wrapped itself around the building. When the sandstorm finally hit, it didn't feel like weather. It felt like something alive was pressing in from all sides. She rushed to secure the doors and windows, pushing old furniture against anything that looked unstable. The storm slammed against the station like a giant fist. Grains of sand hissed as they scraped across the glass, and every metal surface vibrated with a sharp, anxious tone. The emergency light above flickered, not because it was faulty, but because the air itself seemed to pulse with static. Clara crouched near the center of the main room, wrapped in the silver emergency blanket, watching the room dim and bend around her. The sound outside was relentless. It wasn't just noise, it was pressure, like the entire desert had decided to collapse inward. And for a moment, it didn't feel like the station would hold. She counted her breaths, 4 in, 4 out, again and again.
It helped, until it didn't, because just as she found a sliver of calm, the storm suddenly went silent. Not gradually, but instantly. 1 second it was screaming, and the next, there was nothing. No wind, no vibrations, not even the soft hum from the radio. And then came the knock. It wasn't frantic or loud. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone on the other side was politely asking to come in. Clara froze. There was no reason anyone should be here. No footprints in the sand, no signs of life for miles. And yet someone or something was now at the door. The knock came again, same rhythm, same weight. She stayed motionless for what felt like forever, her breath caught in her throat, her palms slick with sweat despite the dry air. She didn't dare make a sound. The storm hadn't just stopped, it had cleared the way for something else. After several long minutes when no third knock came, she finally moved. Slowly, carefully, she crawled to the edge of the room and waited. The silence held. Eventually, she drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, her body exhausted, her mind looping fragments of numbers and whispers that made no sense. In her dream, the desert rose like a wave, and the radio spoke her name in languages she didn't recognize. There were shapes in the sand, and a figure standing still beneath a flickering sky. She woke up gasping. The storm had passed. She stood on shaky legs and moved to the window. The landscape had changed. The dunes had shifted. The terrain looked warped, unfamiliar. And there, in the near distance, a lone figure stood facing the station, perfectly still, like it had been waiting. Clara didn't remember opening the door. One moment she was staring through the dusty window at the figure outside. The next, she stood at the threshold, her hand on the latch, the dry heat brushing past her face. The station was silent behind her, and the air outside was strangely still. The figure remained motionless, not moving even as she stepped out. The sand crunched beneath her boots. Her legs felt weak, but they carried her forward as if guided by something deeper than instinct. As she approached, she realized how wrong her eyes had been. It wasn't just a person. It was her suit, an EVA suit, identical to hers in every detail, worn by someone or something with its back turned towards her. She stopped just a few feet away. Hello? Her voice cracked in the open air. Are you all right? The figure didn't answer. The wind picked up slightly, and the helmet visor reflected the sun at a strange angle, making it impossible to see the face inside. Clara hesitated, then stepped closer and reached out. Before she could touch it, the suit collapsed. No noise, no resistance. It simply fell in on itself, like an empty shell, like it had never been filled with anything alive. She staggered back, heart racing, unsure if she had imagined the whole thing. But the imprint remained in the sand where the figure had stood, and the suit lay there, real, tangible, unsettling. Then the radio on her hip came to life. Static, followed by a burst of garbled voices. None of them made sense. It was as if a dozen signals were trying to speak over each other, none quite reaching the surface. But layered beneath the chaos, there was one clear sentence. We found her. The words were distorted, but unmistakable. Her knees gave out, and she sank into the sand. Found, after all this time. But by who? The signal didn't say, and the station's records were still blank. No flight logs, no rescue plans, just silence. Until now. Over the next hour, she watched the horizon, waiting for movement. And then, just as the sun reached its highest point, a shadow passed overhead. She looked up to see a ship, not one she recognized. It hovered in complete silence, no exhaust, no flashing lights. It made no attempt to land. It simply waited. Clara stood, dusted herself off, and took one final look at the station behind her. It already looked ancient, like something buried and forgotten, even though she had been inside it only minutes before. The door still hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. She took a deep breath and walked toward the ship. As she stepped beneath its shadow, the sand no longer felt hot. The static from her radio faded, and the numbers, those strange numbers, stopped looping in her mind. Everything went quiet. Not empty, but complete. She didn't look back. Whatever had brought her here had finished its purpose. Whether it was a mission, a mistake, or something greater, she no longer questioned it. She was found, and somewhere beyond the dunes, something was waiting to begin.